National Infrastructure Bank, so a funding source for infrastructure projects. So let me ask Leo to come to the stage. Yes, sir. How are you doing?
A real privilege to be here today and to follow this secretary. And the only regret I have is we were going to hear from Secretary John Kerry, who, with the addition perhaps of Rosa DeLauro in the House, has represented this issue year after year to not particularly great effect yet, but it would have been a real pleasure to hear the Secretary's comments as well. I really do want to give credit to some amazing women and men who have been tracking this issue intimately for 20 years, women and men who work every day in our House or in our Senate to try to address the concerns that you and your colleagues have. My own policy commitment to this issue dates back to 2006 when I was appointed the Senior Economic Policy Advisor for the John Edwards campaign. And David Bonnier and I, who had the privilege of running the early days of that campaign, because it didn't have later days, we saw in the characterization of the Two Americas theme that the issues, the three most salient issues confronting this country then and still today, are the massive income inequality we have, trade concerns, and the real unemployment issue. It was when we focused on those three, real unemployment, income inequality, and trade concerns, that we brought into the campaign very aggressively the issue of the nation's declining public infrastructure. Somewhat in a Coles to Newcastle fashion, you all know as well as I do that our public investments in infrastructure, whether measured in both constant or current dollars, are truly at some of the lowest levels that since records have been kept. And after years of investing, we now have a several trillion dollar infrastructure deficit, a deficit that's impeding economic growth. It is indisputably undermining our economy's efficiency, but it's also adding mightily to our real unemployment problem, and it increases our trade deficit, especially in manufactured goods. Yet, as we meet here today, and as Norman and his colleagues have walked us through earlier today, infrastructure investment is perfectly poised to take advantage of the new high-value materials matrix that's just now starting to wash over all of manufacturing. And as we just heard from the Secretary, it's particularly essential to the development of the nation's new growth sectors, whether they be in energy, in driverless vehicles, in ag, or in clean tech. But for me, very personally, the most important aspect in the immediate term of an infrastructure program of the sort that Norman and others have been walking you through is the creation of jobs, millions and millions of jobs. Our nation still confronts a real unemployment figure of about 10 to 12%. We have a real jobs deficit on the order of 8 to 10 million jobs. And of all the policy tools available to the next administration, to the next Congress, only a multi-trillion-dollar, multi-year program of infrastructure investment with its massive multiplier effects throughout the entirety of our economy will be able to create jobs anywhere close to this magnitude. After decades, literally decades of massive underinvesting, America now faces an infrastructure deficit of around $3 trillion, of which $1 to $1.5 trillion is clearly, indisputably, outside the capabilities of our state and local and municipal budgets. And so Blueprint 2025, our hosts today, are with a lot of evidence, a lot of wind in their sails, pushing for creating a dynamic new leadership role for the U.S. government, which would see the next administration, the next Congress, adopt an infrastructure investment program of at least $1 trillion. I agree with this. I've agreed with it intimately for more than a decade. And so in addressing this program that Norman and others have advanced to us, we need to address three important questions, and this is the thrust of my comments today. How do we best finance the federal government's contribution? How do we then best advance and advantage the program itself? And finally, how do we significantly accelerate the project approval process? With regard to financing the federal government's contribution, there really are only two alternatives at the moment. For, with all respect to the Secretary, I throw out the periodic granting of a few $1 billion of block grants, always in the Department of Transportation, when what we have is a long-term, trillion-dollar-plus problem confronting the entirety of the U.S. economy. Of the two alternatives that are of moment that might be available to us, the first is the creation of what we would call a new infrastructure cap, a cap which would utilize Congress's traditional appropriations process to create a new budgetary cap devoted exclusively to infrastructure. And as many of you in the room know firsthand, the two current budgetary caps, the one on defense and the one on non-defense, do not provide any incentive for Congress to allocate funds for infrastructure. So if we did adopt a new infrastructure cap program, it would have to be of such moment as to fund infrastructure at the rate of, say, $100 billion a year for the next 10 years. Those projects, if we used the cap structure, would be funded in the regular appropriations bill enacted each session of Congress by the Congress and then signed by the President. Of course, this would mean that the vagaries of politics, the vagaries of the political process itself, would invariably come into play. Politics aside, the most compelling argument against creating a new infrastructure cap is the same one used against relying on a series of block grants, namely that federal government monies not yet budgeted would be required. And here the difference with the alternative of a national infrastructure bank could not be more stark, since an infrastructure cap by design, by definition, by structure, is simply not leverageable, and thus it cannot be the best method to combine federal, state, local, and private funding sources while minimizing the cost to the federal taxpayers. A national infrastructure bank, what some of us call an NIB, offers 6 distinct opportunities over any alternative. A national infrastructure bank, through its access to and especially its use of leverage, would best increase the capacity of the federal government to fund infrastructure of national and regional significance. It best enhances the ability of the federal government to assist state and local governments in financing public infrastructure and at a much lower cost. It would make public infrastructure investment less dependent, which it must become, less dependent on annual appropriation. It would allow the federal government to leverage the private capital markets. It would best expand the pool of capital available to finance these projects by making it more attractive to large institutional investors, especially the public pension plans and the foreign central banks. It certainly would improve the coordination of regional and national infrastructure projects, and it would best, of all the alternatives, best remove politics from the funding process, and therefore it would counter the standard political objection, which we hear in every Congress, to infrastructure spending. And this is where the rubber hits the road. We've spent several years now trying to put specificity around those 6 opportunities. And I think this is how we can now contemplate a national infrastructure bank that truly hits it out of the park in all 6 of these opportunities. Our particular proposed bank structure would be a wholly owned government corporation with nonpartisan directors, importantly nonpartisan directors appointed by the President but confirmed by the Senate. They would, by definition, include expert infrastructure-related business executives, our nation's labor leaders, infrastructure economists, and public policymakers. And by law, the bank's investment decisions would be thoroughly transparent, thoroughly nonpartisan. And in order to make the bank as responsive as possible to the regional infrastructure development needs, and thus the most effective possible, we believe that somewhat akin to the Federal Reserve, our NIB should be regionalized into a half dozen or so operating districts. In order to fund the broadest possible range of new infrastructure investments in an aggregate amount many times the initial federal funding level, our proposed bank would, with the consent of Treasury, which would be necessary, it would be authorized to sell or issue general purpose bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the federal government. It would sell specific project bonds when necessary, And then I think in a very interesting fashion, as I'll elaborate, it would invite private capital investment. It would be chartered, the NIB, the new NIB, would be chartered to leverage private capital investments made into it, especially seeking out, as I said, the large state and municipal pension funds and the overseas sovereign funds. And then with this capital structure in place, the bank would then advance infrastructure projects across the entirety of our nation through a combination of direct loans, loan guarantees, and other credit enhancements. Federal appropriations in one form or another would provide the initial seed capitalization of the bank, which would then utilize that money to leverage the private capital investments made into it on a ratio of 8 to 10 to 1, a magnitude of leverage and thus funding capability, several factors more than any of the other well-intentioned bank proposals which have been advanced. This one-time only commitment, this one-time only initial capitalization on the order of $100 to $150 billion would then support the $1 to $1.5 trillion of projects. It could come from things such as, easily come from such things as some of the repatriation of overseas profits. But I think that would just sort of reopen the Pandora's box. So we would propose a federal guarantee for that bottom level. And if such federal guarantee is structured to reflect some of the experiences of the several existing international infrastructure banks, as well as a more grounded approach to scoring, we believe that CBO, after extensive conversations, would even conclude that the guarantee does not have to be scored for federal budgetary purposes, which of course would once and forever take out the pay-go federal budget obstacles which Congresswoman DeLaurel, former Senator John Kerry, and others have encountered in trying to advance their own national infrastructure bank proposals. The rationale for not scoring this bottom level guarantee is actually pretty simple, and it's because of the leverage stack which we have proposed for the new bank. That stack is so tall, with so much institutional funding ahead of the guarantee, that with the support of the CBO, we believe there is little likelihood that the guarantee would ever be called on, thus no scoring. In our proposal, states and municipalities who elect to participate in the bank's capitalization through their state and municipal pension plans would gain for their areas infrastructure projects what we call a consideration preference over projects located in states and municipalities who elect not to participate in the bank. We think that this would go a long way to regionalizing, to localizing the new bank's lending activities, and it would also help, and we need to be concerned about this, it would also help mute some of the unwarranted attacks currently underway on the nation's public employee pension plans. Our proposed bank would have under its authorization from Treasury, as one of its functions, the administration of federal guarantees of municipal bonds considered necessary for local governments to finance their infrastructure projects. We are seeing, whether it's in Stockton, California, or in parts here of the East Coast, many local governments are so stretched at this point in time that as the financial crisis continues for them, perhaps even accelerates, they are unable to comfortably, affordably go into the bond marketplace. But what's most important of what I've talked about today is scale. I said in an interview with one of the press people here earlier this morning, we had several agendas when we put this idea to get together. One was scale, quickly getting to the $1 to $1.5 trillion imperative, to make it independent of the partisan politics of this country, and to then turn around and construct the world-class infrastructure that we need here in the United States. Right now, we talk too often and too long about bridges to nowhere in the Congress, when what we need to get back to is being a nation of builders. In answer to the question of how to best advance and best take advantage of the new large-scale infrastructure program, we believe also that is a sidebar to the formation of the bank, a bank not scored for federal budgetary purposes, that all federally supported infrastructure projects should require their purchases to be made here in America, and to qualify as being made in America, at least 75% of that content would have to be manufactured within our borders. No single procedural measure would do more to help resuscitate and grow the U.S. real unemployment and grow U.S. real employment, particularly in the manufacturing sector, than a buy domestic government procurement requirement consistent with our international trade agreements. Three simple things need to happen to affect this. A modern-day successor to the 1933 Buy American Act, domestic sourcing requirements for all government procurement programs, such as the Recovery Act and programs that support U.S. exports, such as the Export-Import Bank. All of these need to be reviewed to ensure that the contracting agencies are fully obeying and implementing the requirements. And then we need to assess actual performance under the WTO's Government Procurement Agreement to make certain that in delivering contracts for American firms and in hiring U.S.-based workers, that they are neither is being overlooked. As Norman and his colleagues hammer home every day, our nation also needs to accelerate the infrastructure approval process. The Secretary spoke upon it from his vantage point at DOT. Right now, as we know, all of us know, there are far too many major infrastructure projects which undergo unreasonably time-consuming permitting and especially environmental reviews. Agency turf wars are now the norm. They are no longer the exception, and the current federal, state, local combined architecture is simply not conducive to timely approval of major infrastructure projects. So as Norman and his colleagues have opined, and others like the nonpartisan group Common Good, there must be a reconstituted approval process which shuttles all of these projects through in no more than 1 year's time. In turn, the White House should be given authority to appoint a single agency as a one-stop shop of sorts in the case of interstate projects. Environmental reviews, especially environmental reviews, must be coordinated through a single designated agency with reasonable limitations on the extent and the subject matters of their reviews. And finally, the commencement of litigation must be restricted to the first 90 days of the project's proposal. So in closing, let me compliment certainly the Secretary Slater. His colleagues have gone before him in DOT, raise a real shout out to Rosa DeLauro and to Senator John Kerry and others, Senator Sherrod Brown, Debbie Stabenow, Sheldon Whitehouse, Elizabeth Warren, who've been so outspoken on this. What we tried to do in our NIB structure, as I said, is several things concurrently. Instant scale, nonpartisan, lots of localization or regionalization, no scoring for the federal government level of support, and sort of a sense of immediacy, a sense of urgency on what is truly a $1.5 trillion problem that cannot be addressed through periodic block grants to the Department of Transportation. It's blowing in the wind. So Norman, thank you. Much like the Secretary, if you want some questions, happy to take them. But thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Yes, sir, in the back. Jeff. Jeff in the back.
Would just love to hear your perspective. Certainly one of the unique challenges with private financing of infrastructure in the U.S. is our unique sort of state municipal bond market and tax-free financing that allows us to do things very cheaply. How would we think about what the expected rate of return or financing rate of projects through a national infrastructure bank, might look like relatively?
I think that's an important question, and it draws a distinction between some of the failures in the past. In my opinion, this cannot be a Wall Street solution with its high expectation of return. We've seen toll roads created, toll bridges built, and then the user community pays Goldman Sachs level rates of return, and they get crushed. Our bank would have real rates of return to the stack on the order of 2 to 3%. All manageable in the budget process of the municipality and the state taking advantage of the bank, but factors less than the private partnerships that have been proffered in the past. The one, and I really do want to elaborate on a point. I have no faith that if we go to Congress and ask for anything approaching this magnitude of numbers, that we will ever get approval. So most of our agenda has been about nonpartisan, non-political process, something that Norman's in favor of, which is districts for the bank, but not scoring the federal participation. If we can go to the floor and say you can have your bank, it's a $1 to $1.5 trillion capitalized bank, sensitive to regions and localities, and it does not have to be scored for federal budgetary purposes, I think all bets have paid off at that point.
Thank you very much for your comments. My name is Gustavo Zerner. I'm president of a company headquartered in Canada. We're actively involved in projects around the world, particularly in the U.S., one of our key markets. I appreciate your comments and your summary points very much. I hope the administration looks at them very closely. What's your impression on the impact of Buy America and the way in which foreign companies, and particularly Canadian companies, pursue business opportunities and co-investment opportunities plus manufacturing from Canada in terms of accessing the U.S. market?
The Buy American, for wrong reasons, often sets up fireworks. Every one of the major developed countries of the world has a binational procurement program in place. Canada, through its provinces, especially as our nearest neighbor. I am not for going against our international trade agreements and what they demand. I am not I am for following the WTO's procurement programs. I'm simply saying that of all of the developed nations, the only one that doesn't have a binational aspect to its infrastructure spending is ours. And so completely in compliance with our trade agreements, completely in compliance with the WTO, just adopt something similar to what Germany has today, what the UK has, which some of your colleagues in Canada has. Nothing more. But if we spend $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion rebuilding our infrastructure in this country, expanding our infrastructure, and we do that with imported materials, especially steel and iron products, I think that's a tragedy. I also think that you will never get the multiplier effect on employment that the bank should advance if you don't couple it with Buy American, appropriately tempered, but Buy American. But you know, for every $1 billion that we spend on infrastructure in this country, we instantly create 25 to 45,000 new jobs into the sustainable future, mostly in manufacturing related, despite all the wonderful women and men who actually build the infrastructure. Most of the economic impact is on the manufactured good going into the project.
One more question.
Just a quick question. Some of the cities or some of the projects that even if the fund was free cash at the U.S. rate, they don't have the ability to commit or the ability to fund those types of, those types of projects. So the shift is to some type of risk sharing, revenue sharing. So to target a 2 to 3% return instead of real equity returns on a revenue sharing or some type of sharing with real risk would seem at odds with the typical, even pension funds are seeking 6 to 8 or 4 to 6, not 2 to 3. So I just curious for that.
They're nominally asking for those rates of return. They're not getting them. Rhode Island being a prime example. But if you take CalPERS and NYSERS, Michigan PERS, Ohio PERS, if you take their fixed income objective returns, 2 to 3% in a stack of highly secured, in a highly secured structure, and I know this from conversations with all of them, they would take that. They would also take it because it makes intimate the women and men who have this resource in CalPERS, the women and men in California who have funded these pension plans, have these pension plans funded on their behalf over decades, if you can localize that in projects favorable to California because California invested in the bank, I think that's 2 home runs. If some state elects not to participate in the bank, that doesn't mean its projects won't be assessed, but it will not be given the preference that the projects from a state who participated in the cap structure would get. But I've seen far too many toll roads crush the middle-class user community. I've seen too many toll bridges crush the middle-class user community to believe that Wall Street has any role to play in this. And every objection we've ever had in Congress to an NIB comes from Wall Street, who says, if there's going to be a bank, it's going to be our bank. I resist that entirely. It needs to be a nonpartisan, large-scale bank of the sort I've described, hopefully without pressure on the federal funding aspect of it.
One last question.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'll ask you questions all day long.
Thank you very much. My name is Sylvester Kasuku. I'm the Director General and Chief Executive Officer of LAPSET Corridor Development Authority in Kenya. We are championing the transformative and game-changer infrastructure project for the African continent. Now, definitely, the idea behind this bank is long overdue, particularly for the US market. In Africa, we've seen the African Development Bank really transform financing of infrastructure projects over the last 10 years. And in terms of lending and the strength of delivery has since changed. And even at country levels today, because of the deficit in infrastructure delivery, country levels are also discussing the possibility of setting up infrastructure banks. Now, coming to the US case, we do know that perhaps there could have been fears that could have led to the delay in establishing the infrastructure development bank within the US. Could it be that perhaps it could affect private sector interests, let's say Wall Street, as you are mentioning? Could it be that it would perhaps lower profitability of banks in the private sector? What are the real fears that have led to this?
Is this on, Norman? It should be, yeah. I apologize for sitting down. I have kind of a bad back this morning. I apologize. I love the question. We have spent 9 years on this topic trying to come up with a schematic, with a structure that works for the United States and meets all of the political objections which have prevented us from having such an alternative in the past. We've traveled to Europe and looked at their development banks. We've studied their charters. We've studied their capabilities. It would be of great delight to me if the structure we've come up with was also applied in the developing world, such as Kenya. There's no aspect of this structure that doesn't have its counterpart elsewhere in the world. We stole a lot of these ideas from people who've done it successfully in the past. The one nuance that we brought to it that I think is clever is we understand intimately the political process here in the United States, which has seemingly put a damper on the public infrastructure investment that Norman and his colleagues are calling for. So the piece that I think stands us in greatest moment is the non-scoring of the federal government's involvement. That would not necessarily be as meaningful in Kenya because your central bank has an interest and a willingness to fund development projects. But we have crushed the backs of inflation in this country in large parts of the world. And to the gentleman in the back's question, if you can go to the fixed income side of the fiduciary community and give them a highly secure 2 to 3% return, I think we will be fully capitalized. I also think that the sovereign institutions offshore would view in these difficult times involvement in this bank both as a political opportunity for their relationships with our country, but also as an economic return for their own endeavors. I think we're going to do one more in the back, and then Norman kicked me 3 times as I sat down, so sadly, it has to be the last question. Please.
Leo, you can blame it on us, and Norman knows us. It's my fault, Norman. I'm sorry for the question. Patrick Hughes from Height. We're an investment bank, capital markets firm based here in D.C., and a member of the Blueprint 2025. So we're looking forward to working with you, Leo, and other members. Curious if you could just address briefly, obviously we've just been through the legislative process here that wrapped up in December with the last long-term bill, and one of the provisions, of course, was a resource cut to TIFIA. And TIFIA, of course, as many know or sort of view, is right, wrong, or otherwise being looked at as sort of the foundation or the kind of the mini experience that hopefully will lead to a national infrastructure bank. Can you just maybe, I think your answer will probably have to do with the comments that resonate with us with respect to kind of the budget scoring, which I think is a very compelling idea, but can you maybe just address some of the shortcomings that you perceive with respect to TIFIA and what led to the budget cut there, and how we'll hopefully kind of improve the commentary around a national infrastructure bank before we kind of take these next couple steps?
I think any time that we glue ourselves to the appropriations process, no matter what is under the design of anybody's idea of a national infrastructure bank, we're going to fail. I thought it was imperative to point out to you that there is structure in place, the CAPS, what's called the CAP programs. We could follow that route. There's precedent for it. But we would have to go to Congress every year for an appropriation. It would be a huge appropriation. We would never get it through. It would be highly politicized. So what we did 10 years ago is we stepped back and we said, how do we get mayors, congresspeople, governors pushing this project, this idea up forward? And the one stumbling block, and it was for Secretary Kerry, it was for Rosa DeLauro, it was for President Obama. It's frankly in some of the proposals we're seeing from the 4 extant candidates for the presidency in this round. It's not a bank if it's just funded with a few $1 billion of quasi-block grants shoved out there. It has to be a bank. It has to be a bank, a regionalized, independent, nonpartisan bank that will attract institutional monies easily into the mix, and as I said, make the political impetus come from the locals, not rely on it here in Washington, D.C. So I think that's it. Thank you so much. Very grateful.
Thanks for coming down. I know your back's still bothering you.